2 Kings chapter 7, verse 3. Now there were 4 men who were lepers at the entrance to the gate, and they said to one another, why are we sitting here until we die? If we say, let us enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. We shall die there. If we sit here, we die also. So now, let us go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we shall live. If they kill us, we shall but die. So they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. But when they came to the edge of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was one there, for the Lord had made the army of the Syrians hear the sound of chariots of horses, the sound of a great army. So they said to one another, behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the king of the Hittites, the king of Egypt, to come against us. So they fled away in the twilight and abandoned their tents, their horses, and their donkeys, leaving the camp as it was, and fled for their lives. And when these lepers came to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent and ate and drank, and they carried off silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. Then they came back and entered another tent and carried off the things from it and went and hid them. Then they said to one another, we are not doing right. This is the day of good news. If we are silent and wait until morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore, let us go and tell the king's household. I want to talk about this morning, with the Lord's help in your prayers, can't keep it to myself. Just look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, there are some things you ought not keep to yourself. Beloved, an artist's best work is not always their most popular work. Noted and famed gospel composer Andre Crouch, you've heard me mention him a couple of weeks ago, who's a famous composer, has scores and scores of music. Oftentimes, his music is sung in churches and arenas across the world. There's a song that I came across recently entitled, Can't Keep It to Myself. This song is not as popular as some of his other works. The music arrangement is clearly 1980s, but the lyrics are still just as meaningful today as they were in yesteryear. Listen to some of the lyrics. I can't keep it to myself. I gotta go and tell somebody. I can't keep it to myself. Somebody's lost. Somebody's dying. I can't keep it to myself. I gotta go and tell somebody else, for they've got to know that Jesus loves them so. Church, these lyrics are theologically accurate, but we should also use these lyrics as a charge to all of us who call ourselves Christians. Jesus has called the church to be fishers of men, but sadly, oftentimes we have settled to be keepers of the aquarium. I'll say it again. Jesus has called the church to be fishers of men, for us to be robust, to be non-discriminatory, but oftentimes in our best efforts, we've settled to be keepers of the aquarium. Beloved, there ought to be more to our Christian life than just coming to church on Sunday morning, getting a little word and worship and going home and repeat the cycle all over again. Church, our text here is couched in the midst of a famine in Samaria. Chapter 6, verse 24, King Ben-Hadad has sieged Samaria, and there is a great famine. The famine is so robust, it's so fierce to the extent that families began to practice cannibalism. Mothers would boil their children and serve their children for evening dinner. The famine was so intense that dove's dung was sold like it was food, and garbage accumulated a value of weight in silver. There was a severe famine in the land. And in the midst of this famine, if you will, beloved, we are introduced to 4 nameless men who have leprosy. Look at them this morning, church. They have a tremendous condition, but they have a faith that's larger than their circumstance. Can I park there for a minute? You can always control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond to life. These men have a contagious, life-threatening disease, but they made up in their minds that we are at least going to try to live the best life that we can. That's a word for someone. You're not the first person to endure pain and turmoil and problems, but you have to learn how to square your shoulders and say, I'm going to learn how to make the best of the circumstance that I'm in. They purpose that we want to do something, but they just didn't say it, but they put action to their words, and they said, we're willing to go over to the enemy's camp. And they went to the enemy's camp. They gave their best efforts, and while they were giving their best efforts, God met them with his divine intervention. Doesn't that sound like God? When you give your best, and sometimes our best does come up short, but God will intervene, and God has a way of making up the difference. God exaggerated their feet, and they went and they plundered the land. But while they were plundering the land, God had worked a supernatural miracle in their life. They said it's not right for us to enjoy the blessings of God and not tell our brothers and sisters what God has done for us. What a word for those of us who are Christian. God has done so much for us. But oftentimes we are guilty of being silent about the blessings of God. And that leads me to my take-home truth this morning. God intervening on our behalf is worthy of public sharing. I believe I said it again. When God works a miracle in your life, when God has shown himself as faithful and dependable, that ought to be a precursor for you to run and tell somebody else about the goodness of the Lord. This is the need to do. Be cautious of becoming so preoccupied with the blessings of God that we fail to share God as the source of all blessings. Oh yes, that's us. We become so preoccupied with our little lives, with our husbands, our wives, and our children, and our jobs. We become so preoccupied, we will walk around and allow people to mislabel our blessings. When we don't tell people that God is the source of our blessings, they'll start thinking it's a result of us. And somebody ought to be able to testify this morning, everything that you have that is good, it is no doing of your own. It is because of the faithfulness of God that is working in and through your life. So let's walk through this text. Learn from these lepers what it means to be evangelistic. First thing we notice in the text is we see that they're in a fatalistic condition. Notice the text opens. The text does not give us their names, but the text does give us their condition. The text says these are 4 men who have leprosy. Let the church say leprosy. Leprosy was a life-threatening disease. It was considered to be highly contagious. We liken it unto a Hansen's skin disease. Oftentimes those who had leprosy, they had open sores and a terrible stench. Their voices was hoarse because of the physical effects that were on their body from the sickness. Everywhere they went, they had to shout unclean. And then to add insult to injury, to have such a physically debilitating disease, to be emotionally estranged, they were also socially ostracized. Oftentimes those who had leprosy, they were forced to live on the outskirts of the city. One scholar says they lived in the houses called the house of the unfortunate. And that's a picture of you and I before we come to meet Jesus Christ. Before we came to meet Jesus Christ, we were living life on the outside. On the outside, you had a job, but you didn't have any fulfillment. You had money, but you had not experienced God's mercy. Life on the outside is lonely. Life on the outside is empty. And somebody can testify, when you don't know Christ, you're living life on the outside. That's what's going on the walls outside of the church. We have people walking around, but they're not living. They're just dead men walking, dead women walking. They just haven't laid down yet. Fatalistic condition. Anytime someone doesn't know Christ, they're a dead man or a dead woman walking. But secondly, we notice from these lepers, they are frustrated with their circumstances. These men have their own convention, and this is what they say, church: why stay here until we die? That they said, we know we're in bad shape, but we're just not going to sit here and rot to death. And that ought to be a word for some believer here. Just because you're in a bad space doesn't mean for you to sit there and do nothing. They said, we're willing to go over and give ourselves over to the enemy. We don't want to sit here and die of hunger. They devised a plan while other people were standing still. What a word of encouragement to us. You got to learn how to plan where everybody else is standing still and reclining. They said, we will go over unto the Syrian camp at twilight. We'll go at nighttime. We're willing to work while everybody else is sleeping. And can I tell you something, church? You have to oftentimes make your most important and serious decisions in the darkness of your own existence. Sometimes that's when God is calling you to do more, when God is calling you to go higher, when God is calling you to go deeper in his love and in his knowledge. At nighttime, they said, we're willing to go further. This is one thing about people of purpose. People of purpose are never satisfied living beneath their potential. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, when you're in God's purpose, you're not satisfied with satisfied. You're not satisfied with just coming and getting a little God. You want God to grow in you, and you want your relationship to be so intense with God that it bubbles over into your everyday life and people can see the light of glory in your life. Then we notice the faithfulness of God. They said, we're going to go. We're going to go over. Literally says we're willing to give ourselves over to our enemies if that's going to help us survive. They go over. These four physically ravaged men, look at them if you will. They have leprosy. They're wrapped in their bed sheets to hide their sores. Their voices are not loud. They're hoarse because they are physically weak. They wrap themselves to hide themselves from the soldiers. They can't run because they're sick. They are limping. They have an increased heart rate, if you will, because anxiety has gripped their heart. They don't know what they're going to meet on the other side. They can have food, or someone can send them back, or even they can be killed. But they said, we're going to get up and move. And because they got up and moved, God worked something on their behalf. God did two things. He intervened on their behalf. The text says while they're walking, the people heard chariots and horses. You missed your shout. These are leprous men. They are walking. They can't even run. But the people that were in the camp that they headed to, they heard horses and chariots. Doesn't that sound like God? When you start moving at God's command, God has a way of exaggerating your strength, and once you get to enemy territory, God has a way of clearing the whole place out. Maybe that's what Isaiah meant when he said, they that wait upon the Lord shall renew. Let the church say renew. That word renew means to exchange
God says, give me your weakness and I'll give you supernatural strength. And is there anybody here that can testify that you moved when you've been weak, when you've been weary, when you've been tired, but God has given you supernatural strength? Somebody came in this morning, you were tired of life and life had beat you down, but God has given you strength.
Oh, that sounds like God to me. But not only does he intervene on their behalf, but he invests in their future. The text says, once they get to the camp, not only are the people gone, but everything is left intact. The tents are full, the horses are tied, and the donkeys are tied as well. Wait a minute, they running, and they didn't even get the stuff that they needed while they were on the run. But God left it so the lepers could have a secured future. Don't miss your shout. God saves you just not from the immediate circumstances that you're in, but God saved you so you can be a witness of his power later on. That's why God is taking care of you. It's just not for your immediate need, but God is taking care of you so you can be a witness to his power. I was riding to church today, and I was thinking while I was on 430, I would be doing all kind of stuff if I wasn't saved. Not me, you too. But I thought about it. God saved me, not just what he was saving me from at 5 years old, but he was saving me for this day so I can tell you about the goodness of God so you can witness and tell somebody else tomorrow. Don't that sound like God? God is saving you just not for today, but God is saving you so you can be a witness to his power in your future. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, God has saved me for a future assignment. We notice foolish behavior anywhere. Oftentimes when we experience the miracles of God, we are often guilty of blessing misappropriation. They have the silver, they have the gold, they have horses, but look at what the text says. They start hiding it. Sound like us, doesn't it? Oftentimes that's what we do. When God blesses us, we run off with the blessing. God has given us the greatest blessing of all. No, it's not your car. It's not your money. It's not your clothes. The greatest gift that God has given you is salvation. And you ought not hide that. You ought to share that with the outside world. Listen, church, this is a problem. Oftentimes we hide the blessings of God, and God says, I want you to share it. In Matthew 5, Jesus says, who lights a candle and places a bucket over it? He said, that's foolish. And many of us, we so swiftly move from the side of a faithful follower to a foolish friend when we fail to share our faith. When you fail to share your faith, it's like lighting a candle and placing a bucket over it. Finally, we see friendly accountability. The text says they reported to each other, this is not right. We have to go and tell the good news of what has happened to us. Listen, church, many of us are guilty of doing the church thing, but failing to do the right thing. I'll say it again. We are guilty of doing the church thing and not the right thing. The church thing is you come to church. Church thing is you're in the ministry. That's wonderful. Church thing, you know when to say amen. You know when to say hallelujah. But the right thing is oftentimes we don't want to share our faith and we are satisfied as long as we are okay. Oftentimes we have settled to be church heroes but Christ failures. Impressed with the religious and never move to authentic relationship. And these men say, it's not right. They're shouting in choral fashion. They are keeping each other in check. And listen, what we learn from these men is we're not to live in isolation. These men were sick together. They were separated. They decided to be courageous. They experienced God's bounty. They did it all together. And listen, we have to be mindful of getting the blessings of God and then ready just to go home and keep it to ourselves. But then also, this is other word, it's an indictment to be silent. The leper shouted and said, it's not right for us to be silent, because if the morning sun hits us and our cousins and them that was over in the family, if they find out that we're enjoying all this food, they will look unfavorably at us. Listen, their conscience was convicted that they were enjoying food and there was other people who were still hungry. Can I push it further? It ought to convict you when you have experienced the liberating power of Jesus Christ and you know that there are still people that are left in bondage. I'm done today when I tell you this. Friendly accountability reminds us we all have an inspiring story to share. Listen what the text says. They said it's not right. We will go back and tell them what God has done for us. The lepers called the gatekeeper. And listen, this is the first flashback we have in the Bible. They have a flashback and they retell what God has done for them. We were sick. God exaggerated our feet. Our feet sounded like a mighty army and horses. And God gave us more than what we can ever imagine. Can I tell you something? That's all good evangelism is having a flashback of what God has done on your behalf. And let me ask you, 11:15 service, when was the last time you had a good flashback when God saved you? Do you remember when you first got saved? Do you remember the fire you had? Do you remember the excitement that you had? No matter what song the choir sung, you clapped your hands. No matter what the preacher preached, you witnessed to. Do you remember how far God has brought you? This is the thing about evangelism. It's just telling your story. And this is the thing. All of us, we have the same common thread in all of our stories. Oh yeah, common thread. This is the common thread. We were all sick before we met Jesus. We were separated from our purpose before we came to know Jesus. We made a decision to go toward God. God intervened on our lives. And the good news about us sharing our story, we all have a common thread. The details are different. This is the reality. We live in different houses, but we're all in the same zip code. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, you may live in a different house, but we are all in the same zip code. And this is the thing, the conclusion of our story is all the same. And this is the conclusion, God did it. And is there anybody here that can testify that your story is whatever that has good, that has happened in your life, God did it? Shake your neighbor's hand and say, neighbor, God did it. And I don't know about you, that's a good story. Somebody's been saved from crack. Somebody's been saved from alcohol. Your story don't have to be dramatic. Your story just has to be compelling. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, I've got a story to tell. And my story is more accurate than MSNBC. My story is clearer than CNN. My story has more authenticity than the reality shows of the Atlanta Housewives. I got a real story. Look where he brought me from. I close. This is my story. Amazing grace shall always be my song of praise. Will y'all help me right along through here? It was grace that bought my liberty. I don't know why he came to love me so, but he
look beyond my fault and somebody. I'm done today. Shake your neighbor's hand and say, neighbor, I got a story. Look where he brought me from. He brought me out of darkness, and I'm walking in the marvelous light. Look where he brought me from. Hallelujah. Doors of the churches.